Okay, we'd like to turn to book of Ezekiel, chapter 47. As we know, Ezekiel was one of those that were taken captive by Babylon. The book opens in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, in the 5th year of the captivity. Ezekiel was 25 when he was taken captive, we're told, and so the writing of Ezekiel, he's now 30 years old. And we read in chapter 1, verse 3, the word of the Lord came expressly unto Ezekiel, and the hand of the Lord was upon him. And reading on in chapter 1, you see that a vision is given him of a storm. That storm represents Babylonian captivity. And in that storm, he is brought to see the throne of God, God's sovereign providence, His control and grace in the storm. In chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, the Holy Spirit enters into him, and he's instructed by God to preach God's message to the people. And in chapters 2 and 3, Ezekiel is instructed of the difficulty that he would have, the resistance that he would encounter. But though Ezekiel was to minister during the darkest days of Judah's history, he was given the assurance that God was in control, that God would be gracious, and he had the promise of God's enablement. In chapters 4 and 5, Ezekiel begins his ministry with 4 sermons that declared the judgment of God. He continues with messages of condemnation, rebuke, and woe through chapter 35. And then in chapters 36 through 39, he preaches messages of God's restoring grace. In chapter 40, we're told in chapter 40, verse 1, it's now the 25th year of the captivity, so 20 years has gone by since his call to preach. And Ezekiel is given a vision, and he's ushered to the door of God's house. And there he's ushered through the temple, where he's given a vision of the future temple and God's people. And from this point to the end of the book, we have visions of the millennial reign of Jesus Christ. And that's where we are here in Ezekiel chapter 47. Afterward, Ezekiel 47, begin reading with verse 1. He brought me again unto the door of the house, and behold, waters issued out from the threshold of the house eastward. For the forefront of the house stood toward the east, and the waters came down from the right side of the house at the south side of the altar. Then brought he me out of the way of the gate northward, and led me about the way without unto the utter gate by the way that looketh eastward, and behold, there ran out waters on the right side. And when that man that had the line in his hand went forth eastward, he measured 1,000 cubits, and he brought me through the waters. The waters were to the ankles. Again he measured 1,000, and brought me through the waters. The waters were to the knees. Again he measured 1,000, and brought me through the waters, and the waters were to the loins. Afterward he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not pass over. For the waters were risen, waters to swim in, a river that could not be passed over. And he said unto me, Son of man, hast thou seen this? Then he brought me and caused me to return to the brink of the river. Now when I had returned, behold, at the bank of the river were very many trees on the one side and on the other. Then said he unto me, These waters issue out toward the east country, go down into the desert, and go into the sea, which being brought forth into the sea, the waters shall be healed. And it shall come to pass that everything that liveth, which moveth, whithersoever the rivers shall come, shall live. And there shall be a very great multitude of fish, because these waters shall come thither. For they shall be healed, and everything shall live whither the river cometh. In these verses, again, Ezekiel is, we're told, brought again to the door of the house. And from there he envisions when the Lord would bring absolute healing to the nation of Israel and blessing that would flow from God's throne and refresh the land. And again, though this is for the nation of Israel, will literally be fulfilled one day in the millennium, we want to make application to ourselves. And there's plenty of application here. I love preaching from this passage. I want to speak on advancing in the river of living water. First of all, we see Ezekiel's vision of a river. He was made aware of this river. He saw this river 5 times in our text, verse 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. Ezekiel says, He brought me. He brought me. It's a phrase that occurs 26 times in the book of Ezekiel. And of course it is indicative of a man under the leadership of God. He brought me. And in our text, God brought him to, again, be aware of this river, to see it, and then to experience something truly amazing and extraordinary. A river, we're told in verse 5 and verse 6, a river that could not be passed over. It's interesting that he asked the question in verse 6. He said, Son of man, hast thou seen this? In other words, do you get it? Do you get it? He knew he saw it, but do you truly see it? And that's a good question for the Lord to ask all of us many, many times. Do you see it? Do you see it? So let's look at this river. Again, this will literally be fulfilled one day in the millennium, but we're applying it to us spiritually. The river has a source. In verse 1, we see waters issued. That is, they emerged and they flowed out from under the threshold of the house. That would be the threshold of the door of the Holy of Holies, which is the place of the mercy seat, which is emblematic of the throne of God. So the source of these waters is the throne of God. John was given sight of such in Revelation 22 and verse 1, and he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb. Notice also here in Ezekiel that these waters flow by way of the altar. That's the place of bloodshedding, the place of sacrifice, the place of atonement, the place of cleansing, the place of redemption. And these waters flow from the throne of God and the altar. And these become, verse 5, a river that could not be passed over. So Ezekiel's made aware of this river. We need to be aware of this river. Now notice the course. Verse 1, it says the waters came down. In verse 8, these waters issue or flow out toward the east country or toward the east region and go down into the desert, which would be the Jordan Valley, and into the sea. So these waters find their way, again, flowing from the throne of God by way of the altar of God. They find their way to the lowest and most needy of places. We see that these waters that Ezekiel saw, again, would become a river that could not be passed over. So they come from God. They flow down into this sin-cursed, barren, unfruitful, unsatisfying world. And again, this is by way of the altar, the sufferings and the sacrifice and the death of Christ, and this out of His love. And this is the only way that these waters can reach the world, is from the throne of God by way of the altar. You cannot bypass the altar. Now notice there are various depths of these waters. In verse 3, they are to the ankles. In verse 4, the waters are to the knees. And in verse 4, they're also to the loins. And in verse 5, waters to swim in. Notice the force of these waters. There's no need for anything to flow into these waters to give it its force, its size, its power. When it leaves the throne of God, it possesses all the power that it needs. So these waters, they flow down from the throne of God by way of the altar. They go down into the desert and they become a river that cannot be passed over. And we see they have power to heal. We see this in verse 8. These waters have healing powers. These waters, they flow into the desert. They flow into the place of need. They flow from God, from the throne of God by way of the altar. They go down into the desert. They have life-giving power. We see that in verse 9. These waters also, in verse 9, have power to revive. And we see that these waters in verse 12 have power to bring forth or to cause growth, fruit, freshness. Everywhere these waters flow, there is fruit that springs up. So these waters, which flow from the throne of God by way of the altar, go down into the desert, become a river that cannot be passed over. These are waters that bring gladness. Notice, if you keep a mark there and turn over to Psalm 46, Psalm 46 and verse 4. Psalm 46, verse 4. There is a river. Yes, there is. There is a river. The streams whereof shall make glad the city of God. There is a river. There is a spiritual river that flows from the throne of God by way of the altar, makes its way down into the desert, and become rivers, a river that cannot be passed over. So what are these waters? What are they? Well, Psalm 65 and verse 9 they are referred to as the river of God, which is full of water. In Psalm 36 and verse 8, the river of thy pleasures. The river of thy pleasures. These waters are also connected with the glory of God. They flow from the temple, the same place that the glory of God filled. In chapter 43 and verse 5, we see that. The glory of the Lord. That's what these rivers represent. That is the beauty and the magnificence of the person of the Lord radiating forth. It is something, these waters are something that can be felt, something that leave an impression. They speak of the glory of God flowing down. And in these waters that one experiences the glory of God. They are life-giving waters. They are healing waters. They are reviving waters. They are fruit-producing waters. They are emblematic of the grace of God, the love of God, the peace of God, the Word of God, all the blessings of salvation. That's what these waters symbolize. So let's look at how Ezekiel is brought to personally experience the river. Again, Psalm 46 verse 4, there is a river. There is a river. And there is. And God's people can experience that river every single day. It's simply the blessings of salvation, God Himself. And Ezekiel is brought to experience this river. If there was a stream of water anywhere in the world, doesn't matter where, that could give life, that could give healing, that could bring restoration, that could give transformation and renewal and recovery. For anyone who stepped into it, people all over the world would be making arrangements to get to that river. There is such a river. There is such a river. Again, Psalm 46 verse 4, there is a river. The streams whereof make glad the city of God. So there is such a river. In a world where there are many rivers, muddy rivers, poisonous, thanks be to God, there are waters which flow down from the throne of God by way of the altar and go into the desert and become a river that cannot be passed over. And these waters bring life and healing and restoration and transformation and renewal and recovery. So in a world that is filled with trials, in a world that is filled with difficulties and struggles, there is a river. There is a river that flows down from the throne of God by way of the altar. And in that river is everything we need. Everything we need is in that river. And I believe that this is the river that Ezekiel was made aware of. This is the river that Ezekiel saw. This is the river that he was brought to experience. Now in Ezekiel's vision, there is a man with a measuring line in his hand who measured 1,000 cubits 4 times. 1,500 feet, 1,000 cubits. 1,000 cubits down the river. Again, 4 times, that's 6,000 feet. Just over a mile. Just over a mile. And he leads Ezekiel along. We see that in verses 3 through verse 5. He leads Ezekiel along. The further Ezekiel followed this man, the deeper the waters become. and the greater Ezekiel's experience becomes. So first of all, he is in ankle-deep waters. We see that in verse 3. So Ezekiel is led approximately 1,500 feet downriver through the waters. And as Ezekiel is walking that 1,500 feet, he has some experience of the waters. But very little of him is covered. The waters are just to the ankles. They have some effect upon him, but very little. There are waters which flow from the throne of God by way of the altar. They go down into the desert, and these waters have life-giving, healing, reviving, fruit-producing powers. Don't be content just to get your feet wet. So Ezekiel is in ankle-deep waters. Again, for many to get in ankle-deep waters, that'd be quite an improvement. Because most are just along sitting on the shore. Then we see in verse 4, Ezekiel is led approximately another 1,500 feet down river. It says through the waters. And the depth of the waters is now to the knees. Now Ezekiel is beginning to feel a little more effect of the water. You walk in water that's ankle deep, and then you go to water that's knee deep and walk. The water has more of effect upon you, has more influence. He's feeling more of the influence and power of the waters. And now a little bit more of Ezekiel is covered. And there are waters which flow from the throne of God by way of the altar. They go down into the desert, and these waters have life-giving, healing, reviving, fruit-producing powers. Don't be content to be knee-deep in such water. Follow the Lord. Follow the Lord in obedience. And pretty soon you'll find yourself in waist-deep waters. We see that in verse 4. So Ezekiel is led approximately another 1,500 feet downriver through the waters. And the depth of the waters is now to his waist. So now Ezekiel is feeling more of the effect, more of the influence, more of the power of the water. You see, the deeper you get into the water, the stronger the influence the waters have. So at this point, the waters have a much greater effect upon the walk of Ezekiel, have a much greater impact upon his walk. At this point, the waters have captured a greater part of Ezekiel's thinking. And at this point, we see much less of Ezekiel than we did when it was ankle deep or knee deep. Again, there are waters that flow from the throne of God by way of the altar down into the desert that have healing and fruit-producing powers. Don't be content to be in waist-deep waters. Continue following the Lord. Verse 5, notice. Afterward, he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not pass over, for the waters were risen, waters to swim in, a river that could not be passed over. Now, Ezekiel is in over his head. His feet no longer are touching the bottom. He has ceased to stand on his own feet. And now we see much, much, much less of Ezekiel than when he was in ankle-deep waters, than when he was in knee-deep waters, and when he was in waist-deep waters. He has ceased to stand on his own feet again. He's now swimming. He's swimming in the life-giving, healing, reviving, fruit-producing waters. This is an exhilarating thing. This is a thrilling thing. This is where fullness is found. This is where the fullness of God is found. This is where joy is found. This is living life abundantly. Keep on following God. Keep on following God in obedience, and you keep on. And eventually, you will be in over your head, spiritually. You will be at a point that you cannot cross over. A failure and a refusal to follow God will get you in over your head in a lot of other things, in the things of this world. And that's where, sadly, a lot of God's people are. They're in over their head, all right, with the things of the world. But if we're going to get in over our head, it needs to be spiritual things. Then notice verse 6. God is asking Ezekiel, we've already brought this up, and he said unto him, Son of man, hast thou seen this? That is, Ezekiel, do you grasp the magnitude of what you're seeing? Do you grasp it? Do you see the wonder of what I am showing you? Do you understand the opportunity of what I'm showing you? Again, it's a good question for us to answer. Do we see the magnitude of what is before us spiritually? Do we see the wonder of spiritual truths? Do we understand the opportunity of what God is showing us and what is before us spiritually? As this man with the measuring line is leading Ezekiel through the waters, it's as if he's saying, Ezekiel, trust me. Ezekiel, take another step. Ezekiel, take another step. And that's how God leads us. He says, trust me. Just take another step. Just take another step. And it's step by step in the spiritual blessings of God. You and I receive this call today. Trust me. Just take another step. A call to look to Christ more fully. To abide in Him more and more. To receive from Him. You ought never be afraid of receiving from the Lord. It's not going to hurt you. Receive. Again, how much of God are we experiencing in life? The deeper and deeper we go spiritually, the less and less of self is visible. Again, ankle deep, you could see all of Ezekiel. Knee deep, a little less. Waist deep, a little less. But waters to swim in, you don't see much of Ezekiel at all. And that's how we know where we are spiritually. How much of self is visible. How much of self is visible. The deeper you get into the waters, the harder it is to jump out. Ankle deep waters, it's not hard to jump out. Knee deep, it's a little more difficult, but you can still do it. Waters to swim in. Why is it that people, they don't stay in the waters very long? Because they don't go very deep. They stay in the shallow and just put their toes in a little bit. Oh, we can have so much more. But so many, they wade in these waters occasionally, only to jump out and go swimming in the ways of the world. There are many muddy waters that flow through this world, but there are also waters that flow from the throne of God by way of the altar of God and go down into the desert that bring healing, that bring reviving. The waters, the rivers of the world, there are the rivers of the world, and there is the river of God, or the waters of God. So which of these has most influenced our life? The muddy waters, or the waters that flow from the throne of God? Are we willing to just keep on following the Lord in obedience and go deeper and deeper and deeper into the glorious river of God? Again, this river originates from the throne of God, but it goes by the way of the altar, the way of sacrifice, and that's where we gain access to. That's where we gain access to it. If it never ran by the altar, we couldn't gain access to it. So the altar is the place of willing surrender. It's where they sacrificed. And the more we surrender, the deeper we advance in the river of God, and the more influential it becomes in our lives. We need to take inventory. How much influence does the spiritual have in our everyday life? How much influence does it have? How much power, how much force does it have in our lives? Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us